Part 32. The Liu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 311. Chapter 311 I just like to pester you. What's going on between you and Sister Avril? Jong Won-in asked casually after taking a bite of something. Liu Zizhu glanced at her and asked, "What's wrong? How do you feel?" Jong Won-in and Zhou Mei really started to explain to him, saying, "I feel that the atmosphere between you is a bit subtle, but I can't put it into words." Liu Zizhu did not answer. He smiled and asked, "Do you still know how to use the word subtle?" "You look down on me." Jong Won-in looked at him sideways. Liu Zizhu smiled apologetically and indicated that he did not dare. "Don't change the subject, tell me quickly, what's wrong with you?" Jong Won-in asked again. "We had a quarrel at the drama club at noon because we had different opinions, so it was inevitable to be a little awkward when we met in the afternoon," Liu Zizhu explained. It was true that he was asked to give advice at the drama club at noon, so the two of them got into a fight over a problem. However, Liu Zizhu did not admit it. There were other reasons why the relationship between them was very subtle. He did not expect that the little girl could see the subtle relationship between them. It seemed that she had grown up and understood the world. "Oh, we are all friends, don't get too stiff," Jong Won-in advised. "I'm sensible, what are you talking about?" This time it was Liu Zizhu's turn to ask Jong Won-in a question. "Sister Avril thinks I match well, so she wants me to go shopping with her on Saturday. Do you have any objection to that?" Jong Won-in said and looked at him. "No objection, but I have to follow." "Why are you following a man when a girl goes shopping? Wouldn't it be better to have some fun with your brothers?" Jong Won-in was speechless. "I just like to pester you," Liu Zizhu said this in a coquettish tone. "We'll talk about it then." Jong Won-in neither agreed nor refused, and Liu Zizhu didn't force her to give an answer. Asterisk. When the two of them got home, the dining table was already full of steaming hot food, which made their appetites whet their appetites. "Hurry up and wash your hands and come over for dinner," Lu Lin, who was sitting on the sofa watching TV with nothing to do, said when he saw two people walking in. The two of them nodded and went to the bathroom, but it was already about 5 minutes later when they came out. Lu Lin heard the two people coming out and complaining without raising their heads, "You are so slow to wash your hands. Your father and I are starving to death. It doesn't look like me at all to be procrastinating." Is very good. It denigrates them and praises itself at the same time. Lu Lin put down the phone in his hand, took a photo of the sofa and stood up. But when he looked up at the two people, he was stunned. He pointed at the two people and moved around between them. It took him a long time to finally open his mouth. Did you go take a bath or take a bath, a hand?" The clothes of both of them were almost wet, Liu Zizhu's short hair was also completely wet, and Jong Won-in's bangs in front became strands. Jong Won-in pointed at Liu Zizhu in a grieved tone and said, "He poured water on me." Liu Zizhu. What a bad person to file a complaint first. It was obviously Jong Won-in who was the first to throw him off, otherwise he wouldn't have fought back. But Lu Lin, who only listened to his daughter's words but not his son's explanation, went berserk and turned into a naughty boy in an instant, chasing Liu Zizhu and saying that he wanted to beat him. Liu Zizhu couldn't explain it, so he had to chase him all over the room, while the villain Jong Won-in sat on the sofa and watched with gusto. In the end, Tang Yu and Lin 11 came out to rescue Liu Zizhu. Young man Liu Zizhu was okay after running a few laps, but Lu Lin was not very strong after running a few laps. Now he could only breathe. It looked funny that the man who once shouted to chase others was defeated first. Lin 11 looked at the three people with helplessness. "Anan, have you bullied Xiao Zhou again?" Tang Yu asked, taking 2 towels and giving them to the two of them. "Please give me recommendation votes, monthly votes, and 5-star praise." End of this chapter. The Liu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 312. Chapter 312 You need someone to carry the bag. As soon as she saw Jongwonen's gloating expression, she knew that she was the evil one who complained first. Sure enough, the next second she saw Jongwonen sticking out her tongue in embarrassment, and loses whose aggrieved eyes. Go and coax your little Bo Tang, you said seriously. Jongwonen stuck out his tongue and ran over with a smile. She sat next to Loses Who, but Loses Who turned his head arrogantly and ignored her. Jongwonen smiled playfully and did not feel embarrassed. She poked Loses Who's waist and said, "Don't be angry, Xiao Jojo, I was wrong." Loses Who snorted and ignored her. Jongwonen noticed that Loses Who was becoming more and more childish. "Don't be angry, don't be angry." Jongwonen shook his arm and said over and over again. Loses Who finally agreed to pay attention to her, turned back to look at her and asked, "Do you feel happy to see me being chased by my father?" "Then it's not a hit, isn't it?" Jongwonen said. "Lulin, shame on you." "That's not possible, running around is really tiring," Loses Who said aggrievedly, looking like a child. "What should I do?" "I was wrong." Jongwonen rubbed her face on his arm. But Loses Who didn't appreciate it. Jongwonen looked around. Lin 11 and Tang Yu were still busy, and Lu Lin was tired and lay on the sofa with his eyes closed to rest. Jongwonen closed her eyes, moved closer to Loses Who, and let out a chirp. Loses Who grinned and felt happy. "Heh, man. Asterisk. The weekends are coming soon." Jongwonen was lying on the sofa with nothing to do on Saturday, waiting for Avril to ask her out. Just sitting there like this, Loses Who looked at her. Jongwonen looked back at her. "What else?" "Don't just sit there, read something," Loses Who said and threw a book in front of Jongwonen. "Straight man." Although Jongwonen complained in her heart, she still read the book obediently. While she was fascinated by the book, Loses Who's phone vibrated. Jongwonen got up from Loses Who's lap and reached out to take the phone over to take a look. "It's Avril," she said. "You can accept the invitation," he said. Jongwonen nodded and pressed the answer button. It was exactly what Loses Who said. Avril came to ask her to go shopping. After hanging up the phone, Jongwonen went upstairs to change clothes. After changing clothes, she happened to see Loses Who coming out of the room at the same time as her. He also changed his clothes. Like Jongwonen, he was dressed in casual clothes, which looked a bit like a couple's clothes. Jongwonen knew what he was going to do, but he still asked knowingly, "Hey, are you going to go out to play with your brothers?" "Yes, I'm looking for your brother," Loses Who replied. Jongwonen was stunned by him. The two walked up the stairs one after another. Jongwonen went down first. She turned around to block Loses Who still had the last 2 steps to go down, and looked at him. Loses Who was already tall, and now he was standing on top, which made Jongwonen appear shorter and more oppressive. "What are you doing?" Loses Who asked. "I won't let you go." Jongwonen put her hands on her hips to show off her momentum. Loses Who didn't feel the slightest momentum, but found it funny. He chuckled and asked, "Why? Why are you following a girl when she goes shopping?" Jongwonen asked. "Carry the bag," Loses Who said simply and neatly. "I have no money and I don't want to buy anything." "I don't need to carry a bag," Jongwonen refused directly. As if by magic, Loses Who took out a bag from behind his back. It was Jongwonen's small satchel. "Now we need a bag carrier," he said. Jongwonen suddenly felt that he was quite scheming. This scheming boy was actually prepared for everything. In the end, Jongwonen couldn't defeat Loses Who, so she had to take him with her. Please give me recommendation votes, monthly votes, and 5-star praise. End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 313. Chapter 313. Feeling worthless for her. When they met with Avril, Avril was not too surprised to see Luz's who. Just say hello and say, "Are you here too?" Luz's who nodded as a response, but Jongwon felt extremely embarrassed. Originally, Jongwon wanted to explain why Luz's who came, but Avril didn't give her a chance. "Since we're here, let's go shopping," she said straight to the point without any ambiguity. Jongwon nodded. Avril just went to a small shop and went to the milk tea shop next door to buy 3 cups of milk tea. "Please, thank you for shopping with me." She looked at the two people with a bright smile, like the warm sun. Jongwon thanked him and took it, but Luz's who kept his pockets unmoved. Jongwon quietly poked Luz's who to signal him to take it, but Luz's who said directly, "I don't like drinking it." Jongwon wanted to beat him at that time. He couldn't be so straight if he didn't like drinking. After all, he bought it with good intentions. It was embarrassing to say this. Avril did feel a little embarrassed about her face, but she knew what kind of person Luz's who was, so she didn't show any discomfort. Smiled and put away the milk tea. "I can drink 2 cups. I just didn't have breakfast, so it's time for breakfast." She rescued herself. Jongwon smiled awkwardly along with her. She wanted to get rid of Luz's who as a scourge. It was so irritating. She didn't give any face to others, and she didn't know whether it was intentional or not. She felt worthless for Avril. It was originally agreed to go shopping with Avril, but in the end Avril walked alone in front, while Jongwon and Luz's who walked side by side behind. Jongwon really felt that this was not good, so she whispered from behind, "Go find a coffee shop and have a cup of coffee." "It's not good of you, and I can't even let you go," she said awkwardly. Luz's who was slightly stunned, thinking that there would still be a time when she couldn't let him go. "Just say you want to drive him away, it's so obvious." He shook his head and refused to listen. "Are you worried about something?" Jongwon asked suddenly. Luz's who still shook his head. Can you believe it when he says he just wants to follow her? If you don't have anything to worry about, just listen to me. Don't you want to carry your bag? I'll give it to you and you can leave, Jongwon said and pushed him out. Avril noticed the two people chattering behind her, and when she turned around, she saw Jongwon pushing Luz's who, as if trying to drive him away. She didn't step forward, didn't stop or dissuade, she just watched. After a while, Luz's who was really pushed away. As he walked away, he looked back 3 times, reluctant to leave. Avril smiled slightly when she saw this scene. When Luz's who walked away, Jongwon ran over and walked to Avril's side and said, "There is no more annoying guy now, let's go shopping." Avril smiled and looked back at the place where Luz's who disappeared, then turned back and asked, "You don't want Luz's who to follow you so much?" Jongwon was slightly stunned. "No, I was afraid that you would feel uncomfortable after thinking about it." Jongwon was afraid of offending Avril, and then hurriedly added, "No, the main reason is that he doesn't feel comfortable following me." Avril tugged her lips and smiled, saying, "Actually, it's pretty good without him." As they talked, the two of them arrived at a store where Avril often buys clothes. "What clothes do you think we should buy this season?" Avril's slender fingers ran across the clothes hanging on the hangers. "Autumn is coming soon, and new clothes are also starting to be worn, so buy autumn ones," Jongwon suggested. "Yes, miss, we have new products, you can come over here and have a look." The shopping guide followed him with a smile. Avril nodded and walked over to the new clothes. She reached out and used her slender fingers to touch them one by one like a dragonfly. Finally, she reached out and picked up a very simple piece of clothing. End of this chapter. The Liu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 314. Chapter 314. I thought the relationship between you was very good. It was a very simple piece of clothing, with only a small human head painted on it as an embellishment. "How about this one?" She picked up the dress with her fingers and showed it to Jongwanan. "Simple and elegant, it's pretty good," Jongwanan said. Avril Lavigne nodded and told the shopping guide the size she usually wears without even trying it on, and then continued to look at it. "Actually, I don't like dignified, gorgeous, and serious clothes unless I'm attending an occasion. I usually like to wear something simpler," Avril said, picking up another piece of clothing. "Gray sweatshirt." "How was it?" she asked. Jongwanan nodded. She felt that she had nothing to suggest. Avril knew exactly what style she wanted and what clothes she wanted to wear. Avril doesn't seem to pay attention to the suggestions given by Jongwanan, because Jongwanan doesn't need to give suggestions at all. She only needs to nod and Avril Lavigne will buy the clothes she mentioned. Jongwanan vaguely felt that Avril's date with her today was not just to buy clothes, but now it was just a guess, and she could only accompany her for shopping. Avril Lavigne bought several pieces of clothing in a row, but after a while she packed them in small bags. If it weren't for the fact that this is a peaceful era, she would really look like a fugitive. Jongwanan carried a few bags for her. Even though she had bought so many things, Avril had no intention of stopping. She led Jongwanan jumping up and down several floors as if she wanted to finish shopping at once. Following her exhaustedly, she suddenly felt that she was a fake woman, and pushing Luz's Who away was not a wise choice. She really needed a bag now. "Sit down for a while." Avril saw that she was exhausted and pointed to the bench over there. Jongwanan was not stupid either. He nodded and the two of them walked over. After sitting down and being silent for a while, Avril suddenly asked, "Do you know there is an important day recently?" "Huh?" Jongwanan was confused. The important day in her memory should be the New Year in a few months, although it is still early. Avril knew from her expression that Jongwanan didn't know about the recent important day. "Then think carefully about whether anyone has a birthday recently," Avril reminded. Jongwanan thought about it for a while and almost lost her mind. In the end, she shook her head and didn't think about it. Avril smiled and said, "I thought you and Luz's Who had a really good relationship." The smile at the corner of her mouth was a bit sarcastic, but Jongwanan didn't look carefully. She became even more confused and said blankly, "It's just very good. They spend almost 24 hours a day together, so how could they have a bad relationship? Moreover, they will have a wedding and start their own family together in the future. If the relationship is not good, how can they think about things in the future?" "But you don't even know his birthday in 3 days," Avril said in surprise. Jongwanan was even more stunned. She stared blankly at the ground and thought again and again, but the final result was the same as before. She still couldn't think of anything. Why didn't she remember Luz's Who's birthday? Is it because I always remember the New Year a few months later and forget about other holidays? "Look at you, you are so careless," Avril said. Her words seemed to be saying, "Look at you, I remember you, let alone you who are so close to him." "What do you mean if you don't remember?" Jongwanan smiled awkwardly. "Remember it in the future. If you don't remember, you can ask me." "I remember," Avril said. Jongwanan smiled even more embarrassingly. How could she be humiliated by her again? Jongwanan suddenly realized that buying clothes was secondary. Maybe this was the ultimate purpose of Avril asking her out. She suddenly felt that Avril was different from the Avril she knew before. End of this chapter. The Liu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 315. Chapter 315. Don't you think it's childish? Let's go pick out a gift for him. Avril nodded to the gift shop opposite the two of them with her chin. Jongwanan nodded and stood up, then followed Avril in a daze, as if her soul was no longer in her body. She blamed herself and was upset. How could she not remember Luz's Who's birthday? Others remembered her but couldn't remember what it was like. Wasn't it obvious that she wanted to make others laugh? Avril turned around to see Jongwanan listlessly smiling. She took a few steps back and put a hand on Jongwanan's shoulder and said, "It's okay, don't be unhappy." Jongwanan heard her comforting herself and nodded, but she didn't like to hear Avril's next words. "With me, you don't have to worry about Zizhu's birthday being forgotten. I will remind you every year in the future so that this will never happen again," she said with a smile. Jongwanan felt very uncomfortable. She had been called Zijo from Lu Zizhu. What did she mean? He also said that he would remind her in the future. She just didn't remember this time and she won't remember it in the future. "No, I will remember it. It was just a mistake," Jongwanan said in a normal tone, without showing anything. Avril smiled and nodded. Jongwanan felt that the hand on her shoulder made her uncomfortable, but she was embarrassed to have too much resentment. After all, they were still friends. Maybe she seemed a little petty if she thought too much. Two people walked into the gift shop. The gift shop is very big and has been open for several years. The things on the shelves are so dazzling that it's hard to make a decision. "What do you want to give?" Avril asked. Jongwanan thought for a while, and when she was about to speak, she remembered that her bag was still in Lu Zizhu's bag. She thought she wouldn't need the money, so she gave Lu Zizhu her wallet. Today may be her most unlucky day. "Enan," Avril thought she didn't hear and shouted again. My money is with Lu Zizhu." Jongwanan gritted her teeth and said. Avril was surprised for a moment and quickly calmed down. "No, you can choose a while first and I'll pay for it for you," Avril said. "No, there is still time. I will use my own money to come over and carefully select a gift for him," she said. Avril nodded knowingly and said nothing more. The two of them stood in front of a pile of watches. Avril looked around and finally locked her eyes. "I'll buy that watch for Zijo." She pointed it out to Jongwanan. It was a watch with a black strap and a white dial, as simple as the clothes Avril chose today. Jongwanan felt as if a bolt of thunder fell from the sky and struck her in half. She also took a fancy to the watch. Soon the clerk came over, and before Jongwanan could give any advice, Avril had already asked the clerk to take out the watch. She took it in her hand and looked around it, then put it in front of Jongwanan. "How about it?" she asked excitedly. Jongwanan had nothing to say, and didn't know what excuse to make to ask Avril to choose a gift again, so she had no choice but to nod. "Good-looking." Jongwanan almost said these two words through gritted teeth. "Pretended up." Avril made up her mind immediately. After Avril paid the money, Jongwanan felt that today was definitely the worst day of her life. She decided to check the calendar when going out in the future, otherwise it would be unlucky to run out like this. Avril exhaled as she walked out of the gift shop. "We've bought everything, let's go have dinner together," Avril said. "Let's go find Xiao Jojo first. He has been alone for a long time and we can't let him wait any longer," Jongwanan said. Avril frowned slightly and said, "Don't you think it's a bit childish to still call me Xiao Jojo? You've all grown up." End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yun. Chapter 316. Chapter 316, Win Back the Victory. Jongwanan felt like he was going crazy. What happened today? What happened to Avril Lavigne? What does it mean? What does it mean that every topic she talks about revolves around Lu Zizhu? And he targeted her everywhere. I don't know where I took the wrong medicine. Just now she thought it was not worth it for Avril to have a friend like Lu Zizhu, but now she feels it is not worth it for herself. I think you should change his name, Avril said. Jongwanan gritted her teeth and suddenly thought of a good title. She looked at Avril with a smile but said, then I'll call him dear. Isn't that childish? Avril obviously didn't expect Jongwanan to be like this. Actually, he will like whatever I call him, Jongwanan said with a smile. She suddenly wanted to make Avril angry and win back the victory. Her smile was bright and moving, which actually made Avril jealous, or she had already been jealous. Avril nodded. The two took the elevator down to the first floor. Luzes, who was still in the cafe at the moment. He was sitting lazily on his seat with a cup of coffee in front of him. The sunlight hitting his body gave him a thin layer of gold. A sense of nobility arises from this. The moment Jongwanan saw him, she felt that all the inexplicable grievances she had just suffered from Avril disappeared. She walked over with a smile and lightly hit Luzes on the head from behind. Luzes might have been distracted, so he turned around in confusion and smiled when he saw Jongwanan. "Dear, I'm back." Jongwanan smiled and walked around to sit next to him, then naturally picked up the coffee on the table and took a sip. Luzes looked at her and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Dear. What's going on?" Luzes took the coffee in Jongwanan's hand and said softly, "It's cold." Then he asked the waiter to order a similar drink for Jongwanan. After the waiter left, he seemed to have just seen Avril, pointing to the seat opposite and motioning for her to sit. But he didn't intend to talk to Avril. "Are you hungry? Are you tired?" he turned to ask Jongwanan, who was sitting aside. Jongwanan nodded and said coquettishly, "Tired, hungry, so hungry, so hungry." "How about going to eat? What do you want to eat?" Luzes asked. Jongwanan took a sip of the coffee the waiter had just served and looked at Avril. "What do you want to eat?" She sat next to Luzes, one was gentle and the other was cold, but they looked like they should have been a couple. Avril suddenly felt a sharp pain and her eyes felt a little uncomfortable. She rubbed her eyes and said, "It's up to you. You go shopping with me today. You order and I pay," she said a little tiredly. Jongwanan raised her eyebrows slightly, suddenly feeling that Avril had returned to her original appearance, no longer the same as when she was just shopping. So she was showing off. She had the same look in front of Luzes and she had the same look in front of her. But think about it, she wasn't like this before. Jongwanan couldn't help but fall into deep thought. She was a little confused about this woman. "Anan, what do you want to eat?" Avril's voice pulled her back. Jongwanan stopped being polite to her and said, "A new Japanese restaurant has opened on the third floor. You can go and try it." "Okay, let's go," Avril said boldly. Then the three of them got up and walked upstairs. "Have you bought anything?" Luzes asked on the way. Jongwanan shook his head. "Why not buy it, short of money?" "No, it's not needed yet." "Then when will you need me again to come with you?" Jongwanan looked at him and suddenly smiled. "Are you here to carry your bag?" The way Luzes hung her small satchel around her neck was really funny. If she met her classmates, Luzes image would be ruined. "I'm also willing to carry the bag," he said. Jongwanan nodded. She thought that no matter who she went shopping with next time, she would not push Luzes far away, otherwise she didn't know who would be the next one to treat her badly. End of this chapter. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 317. Chapter 317. Things were different before and now. The three of them entered the Japanese food store. There were many people coming to try out the newly opened store, but fortunately they arrived early and still had a seat. While waiting for the food, they sat opposite each other in boredom and had nothing to say. "Anan, where's that little bag?" Avril asked suddenly. Jongwanan was confused, looked around at the large and small bags on the ground, stood up from Luzes and sat upright, and asked, "What bag?" "That's it." Avril winked at her. Jongwanan understood. "In your pile, I remember you put it in a big bag," Jongwanan said. Avril immediately looked back, and found it 10 seconds later. She took the bag and chuckled, put it on the table, and then slowly pushed it in front of Luzes. Loses who raised his eyes and looked at her, as if he was asking what she meant. Avril Lavigne tapped the small bag with her chin and said, "Open it and take a look." Loses who frowned slightly and looked at Avril and then at Jongwanan. Avril just smiled, but Jongwanan slowly drank the drink in front of him, his eyes wandering. "Take it apart and take a look," Avril urged. "What?" Loses who glanced at the bag but did not open it. "You'll know when you take it apart." She wanted to keep it mysterious. But Loses who didn't understand the style, and maybe he didn't want to speculate with her like this. It was boring. He said calmly, "I don't like guessing blind boxes." Avril was surprised, looked at him and said, "This is not a blind box." "Everything you can't see is a blind box," he said. Avril understands, as long as she doesn't tell what's inside, Loses who will definitely not open it. She curled her lips and looked at Loses who and said with a bit of complaint, "I was going to give you a surprise, but you don't understand the style at all. I'm going to go abroad with my parents tomorrow to stay for a few days. I guess it's your birthday. I can't come back, so I bought it for you in advance. It contains a watch. I hope you don't mind." Loses who nodded and thanked him. He understood. "Your birthday is in 3 days, right? And doesn't even remember it? I'm afraid it will be bad if I remember it wrong." She glanced at Jongwanan from the corner of her eye as she lowered her head and said nothing. Jongwanan felt her gaze, but she couldn't say anything. She just lowered her head, lower and lower. "Oh, really?" Loses who narrowed his eyes and looked at Jongwanan. Jongwanan also felt his gaze, and she felt a guilty conscience. Just when she was about to raise her head to explain a few words, she heard Loses who's slow voice. "That's a coincidence. I'm the same as Anan. I don't remember my birthday either. I don't like celebrating birthdays, and I don't like others to help me remember it, and I don't like other people's reminders. We both don't remember it, so it's a match made in heaven." "Right." Avril's eyes widened in surprise. "He doesn't like birthdays? This is impossible, and how can this matter be related to the issue of creation in heaven? Did you? The past is the past, and the present is the present. The past is different from the present, just like human beings." Loses who looked at Avril and said. Avril felt that she was a little embarrassed at the moment. She originally wanted Loses who to know that Jongwanan didn't remember his birthday, but she didn't expect that Loses who was always protecting her. Loses who pushed the gifts on the table over again and said, "I don't like birthdays, and I don't like gifts. Thank you for your kindness. Next time you send a gift, send it to Anan and I's wedding." The atmosphere became silent, except for the sound of breathing. So much so that the waiter didn't dare to breathe when he came in to serve the food. Loses who took care of Jongwanan throughout the meal, but Avril felt that the food was tasteless at all, so she made an excuse and said she had to go to the toilet and went out first. "You're not happy?" After Avril went out, Loses who turned around and reached out to hold Jongwanan's face and said. It was not a question, he was sure. End of this chapter. The Liu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 318. Chapter 318. She only relies on you and doesn't like you. Jongwanan's eyes were forced to meet Loses who's affectionate eyes, and she couldn't avoid them. "Is she giving you a hard time?" Loses who asked again. Jongwanan didn't answer. Loses who sighed, "You shouldn't have pushed me away. I've been worried about you since you left." Jongwanan looked at his frown and stretched out her hand to smooth it for him. "Don't frown, like a little old man." Jongwanan laughed and teased him. Loses who pinched her nose with one hand, gritted his teeth and said, "You can still laugh." "Why don't you laugh?" Jongwanan grabbed the wrist of Loses who's hand that squeezed her. "What did she tell you?" Loses who asked. "It's nothing," Jongwanan said. "She doesn't want to be a bad woman who speaks ill of others behind their backs." Loses who knew that she didn't want to say anything, and he could probably guess what Avril was doing to her. Jongwon doesn't want to say that, then he will respect her and won't make it difficult for her. Did she tell you something? Your attitude towards her has changed. It was like this last time. You said it was because you had a quarrel in the drama club, but I don't believe it anymore. Jongwon looked at her intently. Loses who? Loses whose attitude towards Avril Lavigne has changed, and Avril Lavigne's attitude towards her has changed. Before Loses who could say anything, Jongwon asked, She likes you, right? I'm just guessing, don't be angry. Loses who looked at Jongwon with his deep eyes, and nodded after a while. Jongwon didn't say anything and just nodded. After a while, Jongwon asked again, is it the last time? You said you had a quarrel in the drama club. We did have a quarrel. Before the quarrel, she expressed that she wanted to change our relationship with me, so we started to quarrel in the afternoon when she felt angry, he explained. Jongwon nodded and said nothing. I didn't agree. I told her very clearly. Loses who was a little panicked when she didn't speak. Jongwon looked at him with a smile and said, I believe you. Loses who nodded, which made him feel relieved. Avril was at the door and listened to the conversation inside clearly. Her nose felt very sore, and then she walked away. She didn't want to listen anymore. Actually, Loses who didn't talk about some of their conversations that day. Lavigne made a bold confession that day, regardless of their current relationship as friends. She said, Jongwon is young and you are older than her. She may be relying on you, not liking you. I can tell whether she likes me or not. I don't need you to sow discord, Loses who said with a cold face that day. I think you deserve better, like me in front of you, she said. I already have a better one, it's Jongwon. You won't give me any chance. No, we can only be friends. I hope you don't cross the line between us. I have no shortage of friends. Then don't do it, Loses who said and planned to leave. You won't give him any chance, will you? Avril asked him behind her back. Loses who didn't stop and said coldly, I won't give it. So from that day on, he began to distance himself from Avril. He also had no shortage of friends, but he didn't want anyone to instigate a relationship between him and Jongwon. He knew best what their relationship was like. It is said that the authorities are obsessed with it and the onlookers know the truth, but he feels that he is the person in the authority who knows the truth, and few bystanders know the truth. Avril's face was not very good when she came back. She picked up the things on the ground and said, I paid the money, and I have to leave beforehand. You guys eat slowly. Avril suddenly stopped when she reached the door, just keep the gift. Loses who glanced at the small bag on the table, but Avril didn't take it away. When Avril left, neither of them spoke. Avril did not ask the two to see her off, and walked out on her own. End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Liu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yoon. Chapter 319. Chapter 319 Couple Costume. Isn't this a bad thing? Jongwon asked after Avril left, looking at the closed door. Do you feel good when she treats you? Loses who asked her. Jongwon stopped talking. The two sat for a while before Loses who stood up and said, Let's go, my dear. He followed Jongwon's example of calling her in the coffee shop just now. Jongwon smiled and the atmosphere became lively. She stretched out her hand and waited for Loses who to help her, so Loses who went to help her like a gentleman and in a serious manner. The two walked out of the Japanese food store hand in hand. As she was about to go downstairs, Jongwon suddenly remembered something. She said, I want to go shopping. Loses who looked at her, aren't you tired? Jongwon shook her head, so Loses who took her upstairs. Wait a minute, Lower your head. Zhang Wanan held his hand and stood there and said. Loses who thought she was going to kiss him the old way again, so he smiled sweetly and lowered his head, but he couldn't wait for the soft touch. Zhang Wanan just took the bag off his neck for convenience. Loses whose face turned dark and he said nothing. I want to carry my own backpack, Zhang Wanan said and put the satchel on her body. Autumn is coming, and you haven't bought any clothes this autumn yet, Loses who said. You didn't buy it either, Zhang Wanan said. How about we go shopping? Zhang Wanan silently touched her small satchel and whispered, I don't have much pocket money left. Loses who sneered, I do. Then did you bring it? Zhang Wanan looked at him with expectation. She is also a little money lover. Loses who nodded, it's in your bag. Zhang Wanan was surprised that he actually put the money in her bag. She didn't quite believe it, so she opened the bag and looked. Sure enough, there were two wallets inside, one for her and the other for Loses who. Zhang Wanan took out Loses who's wallet and was surprised. There were several bank cards in it, as well as some large red flowered bills lying inside. Go, Zhang Wanan took her wallet and stepped forward to issue the order. So the two people started shopping frantically. Zhang Wanan didn't buy much, and Loses who was willing to spend money for her. Two people walked into a clothing store. The clerk saw them and walked over with a smile, welcome. What clothes do you want, sir? Zhang Wanan raised her head and looked at Loses who, and Loses who also looked at her. Suddenly Zhang Wanan's mind flashed and she smiled slyly, couple costume. The clerk could also speak. When Zhang Wanan said this, she led the two of them over and said, you two look like a couple at first glance. You look like a match made in heaven. Maybe you are, childhood sweethearts, right? How do you know? Zhang Wanan was surprised. It looks like you have a good relationship. These are all new in the store and can be worn now, the clerk introduced enthusiastically. Zhang Wanan nodded. She could see that they were all thin and they fit right in now. Zhang Wanan picked up a long-sleeved shirt with her fingers. There was a big bear painted on the front, which looked very childish. She picked it up and showed it to Loses who frowned slightly. Zhang Wanan knew that he didn't like it, and she didn't like it either. She just thought the bear was fun. And she knew that Loses who liked simple clothes, because his wardrobe only had black and white colors, and most of them only had a logo or a small pattern on them. How about this one? It is a thin black sweatshirt with a few letters in the upper left corner, which is love. Zhang Wanan fell in love with that piece of clothing at a glance. It fit the standard of the clothes in Loses who's wardrobe. Loses who looked at it for a few times, and then Zhang Wanan remembered that she had asked Loses who if he wanted to buy a couple's outfit. She put her clothes back in a sullen voice, but she neglected to do so. End of this chapter. The Lu family's wife is so sweet. Author, Yun. Chapter 320. Chapter 320 I do. Loses who held down her hand as she put the clothes back. What? You don't like it? Zhang Wanan shook his head. No, I'm afraid you won't like it. How could I not like it? I just said that I wanted to buy couples clothes because I was hot-headed, and I haven't asked your opinion yet. I do. Zhang Wanan was stunned. They stood upright facing each other. As soon as Loses who said I do, she always felt that their scene had changed. She seemed to be transferred to a grand wedding in an instant. She was standing in a white wedding dress, and Loses who was wearing a wedding dress. A black suit stood opposite her. When the officiant asks, would you like to do that? Loses who replied, I do. She is willing to. What are you thinking about? Loses who saw that she was distracted and reached out to pat her head. Zhang Wanan came back to her senses and blushed. Then let's go try on clothes, she said. So each of them carried a piece of clothing, she carried white, and he carried black. She entered the fitting room on the left, and he entered the fitting room on the right. After entering the fitting room, they moved in unison, and the fitting room was cleared with a swipe sound. The door curtain is closed. A few minutes later, the door curtains rang together again, and the two people walked out and faced the mirror opposite. Luzes who stared at Jongwanan for a while and couldn't help but raise the corners of his mouth. Jongwanan also stared at Luzes who. It is obviously an ordinary couple's outfit, but they tried it out with the feeling of a wedding dress and a suit, solemn. This is their first couple outfit. The two of them didn't take it off after wearing it, so they asked the clerk to cut off the tag, paid the money, and walked out happily holding hands. It's good to be young, the clerk sighed as he looked at the active backs of the two people. I want to buy you a gift, Jongwanan said. What gift do you want to buy? Luzes who asked. Birthday gift. Seriously, are you angry that I didn't remember your birthday? Jongwanan asked seriously. I'm not angry, Luzes who replied seriously. Jongwanan pouted, you must be angry. How could you not remember your birthday? Moreover, you said you don't like birthdays anymore. You are clearly trying to save me. Luzes who smiled and said nothing, so what? Was he wrong to protect her? Are you angry? Jongwanan asked again. Is there any compensation for being angry? Luzes who asked. No, Jongwanan replied. Then it's better not to be angry. If you are angry, there is no compensation. It's okay not to be angry. It's better not to be angry. Being angry is very harmful to the body, he said seriously. Jongwanan was speechless for a moment. You are too tall, she said this suddenly and nonsensically. Ah. Jongwanan smiled and said nothing. You are so tall that it's hard for me to kiss you. It would be nice if she grew taller or he got shorter. I'll buy you a gift later to make it up to you, okay? Jongwanan asked. Luzes who nodded in agreement. He actually hoped to receive Jongwanan's gift. The two of them came to the gift shop, but before entering, Jongwanan blocked Luzes who at the door. Buying gifts must be mysterious. You won't feel it when you come in. Luzes who chuckled, walked to a chair and sat down. Can I wait for you here? Jongwanan smiled with satisfaction and ran in. She wandered around for a long time. The watch she was interested in was taken away by Avril, so she couldn't buy it a second time. It was boring. She wanted to buy a new one, which would exceed the gift Avril gave her. Jongwanan walked around and walked past the shelf and quickly returned. She stopped for a while and looked at the colorful headbands on it. She wondered what would happen if Luzes who put it on. She thinks. Thinking about it, she already reached out and picked up a hair tie that was full of small flowers and looked like coaxing a child. She felt that Luzes who would definitely look good wearing it. After choosing her hairband, she continued walking inside, dazzled. End of this chapter.